Hello class, and welcome to the Soundbites video for week 7. Last week with our study of country, we started to initiate this approach which I call striping through history, roughly from the 70s to the present decade, multiple times looking at different genres as a focus. This allows us to trace the through line of various narratives throughout history more cleanly than if we sort of looked at it as a sushi slice for every single decade. Now, one of the places where this really pays off is, I believe, this week, where we'll be discussing the connections between disco as it develops into house music and techno, and then finally comes to flourish in the mainstream as EDM, electronic dance music, which still permeates the sound of music today. So, without further ado, let's get started. Alright, I've titled this session Feeling the Love, after Donna Summer's famous track, disco, house, and EDM, but really mostly focusing on disco and EDM. Alright, so to start with this quote. This is a quote by Steve Dahl, a character that we'll be encountering and you'll be learning more about in a documentary on Disco Demolition Night. In the context of interviews about Disco Demolition Night, Steve Dahl said about disco, "Disco is an intimidating lifestyle. It's an intimidating culture. And at some point, there it was being forced down our throats." Alright, so why do I start my week on disco with this quote? Well, I think because it's going to help us realize the gravity and the importance with which, first of all, these discussions about aesthetics and musical styles can have. This was someone from the Midwest who really felt like this different sound, this different musical culture that represented a different lifestyle and different type of urban culture in this case, really was perceived as a threat to their very way of life, their very way of being. Now, the other thing that I think it points to is just how influential the rise of disco was, how sort of rapid and how ubiquitous it was on the radio stations, such that it caused people maybe who were fans more of classic rock or early metal or new age rock, that people who favored these different manifestations suddenly felt like their lives are being invaded by disco and their radio stations as well. So this context helps us to better understand, if not personally relate, but to understand at least why something like Disco Demolition Night and the Disco Sucks campaign might have happened. I remember speaking at one point to one of my colleagues who's a bit older than I am, and who was reminiscing about playing in a band around this time in the 70s, and then just hearing the Bee Gees, hearing the Village People on the radio, and mentioning to me that she felt nauseated whenever she heard a disco track come on the record, and just wished for the good old days where it was just blues-influenced rock and stuff like Woodstock, people like Janis Joplin, or she mentioned that when Bruce Springsteen came out, he felt like a sort of messiah to the music scene, to sort of return music and rock back to its roots. So there are these aesthetic wars between something that's more electronically focused like disco and the sort of performance, live-focused genres like folk or rock and the like. But on that note, there's another dimension to the backlash against disco, one that is very much social rather than just regional or just musical and aesthetic. And that has to do with the kinds of communities and the kinds of social demographics that disco represented. So when we listen here to the quote by music producer Nicky Ciano, he reports, "The backlash against disco was anti-gay, but was also anti-women and anti-color, that is, anti-people of color. It was men take back your power." Okay, so that gives quite a different sort of a shading or a different flavor on this Disco Sucks movement, because disco music originated in and was practiced by these more marginalized communities like the LGBTQ community and many black artists and many female artists, that the backlash against disco simultaneously represented a pushback against those different sorts of identities. And so, as I said in the email for the week, music is never just music, but also entangles our various different social cultural identities in the mix, so that the politics surrounding the acceptance or rejection of different musical genres becomes emblematic of the acceptance or rejection of different kinds of people. And finally, with more of a look towards the present in a video that you'll be hearing from later. This is speaking of Daft Punk's album Random Access Memories. Random Access Memories opens with Give Life Back to Music, a title that seems to be Daft Punk's thesis on the album. They want to bring the lively joy that was disco back into the mainstream. So this sort of seeds the latter part of our presentation, where we'll be looking at the way that disco sort of comes back from being pushed underground as EDM in a lot of ways continues to persist in the mainstream and found finally that mainstream acceptance and success. Although, as I'll talk about then, not without some caveats. But let's go ahead and check out some of the artists that we'll be taking a deeper look into this week. Under the genre of disco, although there are many names and groups we could look at, I'm choosing to highlight Donna Summer, of course, as one of the classic faces of disco, as well as Gloria Gaynor. And although, again, there were many groups, some of them male-led, some of them groups, vocalists, I think these two solo black women artists really helped exemplify the way that disco presented, in a lot of ways, a minoritized sound and a face to the genre. Next, in early EDM, early electronic music, we'll be looking at away from the shores of the United States, first at Kraftwerk, a European-German artist group, and then at Yellow Magic Orchestra, a Japanese group. Now, these two groups in different parts of the world were formulating almost simultaneously in history works that would become very influential in the formation not only of later EDM music, but also of hip-hop and rap and the like. And finally, when we look at EDM or electronic dance music proper as it comes to rise in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we'll be focusing on Daft Punk, as well as the DJ Tiesto. There are many more names I could have chosen here, as always is the case, but I'm focusing on Tiesto kind of as an exhibit A or case study of what a great many DJs had done around that time and continue to do to the present day. So with that, let's take a look at the history of disco, which you'll be learning a lot more about in the rest of the week's materials. So disco is a genre that was born from New York's Greenwich Village, which actually Bob Dylan was famous for playing in and writing quite a few famous songs in, I think including The Times They Are Changing. So this was sort of a countercultural and in a lot of ways bohemian expression and community in New York City, especially for black and gay communities in around the 70s. Now, this was a time when a gay culture and other LGBT identities started to rise more to the fore, although also experienced a lot of social pushback, and that's something that we actually see played out in the history of disco, as we'll see. So the music of disco focused on the purposes of dancing for dance clubs, and specifically in this sort of underground scene of these urban gay dance clubs in the 70s. And so the music was very much produced in this context and in a lot of ways celebrated and practiced by these communities. Now, musically, disco is a genre that absorbed many other musical styles, and within that context started to develop electronic instruments and electronic timbres to a greater extent. Especially the engineer and composer Giorgio Moroder was a big influence here. We'll talk more about that with Donna Summer. Primary artists, at least the ones I'm highlighting, were women, especially black women, and here again Donna Summer and Gloria Gaynor come much to mind. Of course, there are other artists and groups that we could include here, but again, it just goes to show how the face of disco might have looked and sounded very different than people are used to, let's say, with mainstream rock music. Now, in 1973, Manu Dibango's track Sol Makossa was hailed as a disco song that achieved mainstream success on the mainstream pop charts. And it was so successful that it started to drive the sales of these 12-inch records, which were longer and allowed for not only higher quality play, but specifically more runtime than the standard 45 RPM record. So this allowed the music to begin to be lengthened, as you'll learn about in one of the other videos this week. Now, by 1979, disco had achieved mainstream success. It was being played a lot on the radio, having successful hits on the pop charts. You even had, for example, the Grammys create a category for disco to recognize the best disco tracks. But then, at that point, going into the 80s, started to face this extreme backlash. So there was sort of like an organized disco sucks movement and t-shirts that would say disco sucks and be commonly sold. And part of this disco sucks movement culminated in Disco Demolition Night. Just to sort of preview that, Disco Demolition Night was organized by Steve Dahl, who we heard from earlier, in the Midwest. They rented out a baseball field and collected a big bin of records where you could attend just if you brought a record to be destroyed. And then they set off a bomb that blew up all those bin of records altogether, sort of in this big statement. Now, Disco Demolition Night was heavily covered in the news headlines and sort of was emblematic for this pushback movement against disco that resulted in it being reduced in popularity and sort of pushed from the mainstream. So after this brief-ish window of 6-7 years in the limelight, disco was then pushed back underground, where it had initially originated from, but continued to develop in these underground clubs as house music to reemerge later into the mainstream as EDM, in the 2000s, which we'll cover the back end of that later. Now, I mentioned that the history of disco itself mirrors the history of what a lot of the LGBTQ community experienced, and one of the sources that you'll be reading really speaks of that. And so during the 70s, as gay and lesbian and bisexual and other sorts of identities began to become more visible, there was much of conservative society, like the moral majority, for example, Jerry Falwell and other things like that, that started to really have that backlash and push against the LGBTQ community. So by the 80s, you sort of had them pushed more underground or in the closet again. So that's, again, mirroring what actually happened with disco music. All right, so let's start by talking about our artist with Donna Summer. Donna Summer is known as the Queen of Disco. She was a frequent collaborator with the producer Giorgio Moroder, who in a lot of ways was sort of the compositional or the engineer producer behind the sound of disco, working with the synths, mastering the records and doing the production, etc. But for Donna Summer, Summer's music was upbeat, mostly in tone, again, focused on dance and an overall positive vibe. But Donna Summer's own life, as we'll see is often a common theme, was filled with these difficult and abusive relationships. At different points in her life, she contemplated suicide, went through chronic depression, and much more. So in this context, her 1977 disco hit, I Feel Love, which was one of probably her most famous collaboration with Giorgio Moroder, became definitive of the sound of disco in its prime, in its heyday. This was a track that employed various synthesizers, sequenced arpeggiators, live multi-tracking with Donna Summer overdubbing her own voice in several harmonized layers, and more techniques which at the time would have been very revolutionary, even if we're sort of more used to that sound by now. Now, Donna Summer's music is also known for being unashamed and unabashed in its celebration of sexuality, I Feel Love being a great example. Another that I've included on the playlist is Love to Love You Baby, which you might notice can be a bit surprising in terms of its sexual subject matter. And so many radio stations consider this to be so risque that they banned the song. Now, last week with country, we mentioned those odd ducks, which sometimes get inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, despite being more of a country artist, people like Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton. Well, it turns out Donna Summer in 2013 was also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, being cited as an influence on Madonna, Beyonce, as well as the modern EDM genre. So Donna Summer continues to be very influential, although as a recording artist, she may never have really eclipsed her popularity that peaked in around 1977 with I Feel Love. Now we see a very similar story to Donna Summer with our next artist, Gloria Gaynor. So Gloria Gaynor was born Gloria Fowles, and she broke into the music industry with her album Never Can Say Goodbye in 1975, right around the same time as Donna Summer. Now this album, which only had 3 tracks, was notable for being through-composed, meaning it didn't have separations between each track. It was just meant to be heard end on end on end. And so it essentially creates this full 19 minutes of runtime with a seamless track with no intended musical breaks. It's meant to just play into itself. And the longer length time, the long-form structure here, foreshadows the move towards the 12-inch record that we mentioned disco was moving towards. Now, 3 years later, in 1978, Gaynor really broke through with I Will Survive, still her most enduring hit to this day. The track went multiple platinum in terms of its Billboard ratings. It was given a Grammy Award as the best disco song from that year. It sold 15 million records. And its cultural impact is considerable as well. It is considered an empowerment anthem for women and for feminism, as well as for LGBTQ rights, again, with the association with the disco community, although Gaynor herself identified it more with the feminist aspect. Her song I Am What I Am, released in 1984, also became another LGBTQ plus community anthem. Now, back to I Will Survive for a second. Now, when it reached platinum in 1979, this sort of is emblematic of the height of disco's success in the mainstream. So for that reason, the Library of Congress installed it as a cultural artifact. Now, even though it became sort of this larger-than-life track which so many different communities and types of people identified with, for Gaynor it was always a very personal, intimately personal, autobiographical song. One about her being brought up in a context of poverty, of childhood sexual abuse, as well as having an accident just a mere 6 months before she went in to record the song that left her paralyzed from the waist down for quite some time. So this was really a survival anthem for just all the stuff that she went through in her life that she was pledging being able to endure through. Now, like Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor never really eclipsed the popularity, and again, because disco got forced back underground, it's no wonder that their artists sort of suffered a similar fate. But in the 1990s, Gloria Gaynor was popular and prominent in acting careers, in some shows on TV and Broadway, and actually was able to make a return album in 2002 called I Wish You Love. So while she never really reached the height of her popularity in the late 70s and the early 80s, she continued to have a career after that point. But now let's go ahead and talk about EDM and the arrival of EDM on the scene. Now, I mentioned here, as well as in the email, that I sort of have a personal connection, which was that I remember going through these years of sort of the late 90s into the 2000s. Most of what, at least the music I was listening to, was very rock or metal influenced, like progressive metal, new metal. There was the sort of alt rock of Nirvana and the like, so as well as some of the softer rock that was coming out like Coldplay. So that was in the context in which EDM first started to arise. And in this context that focused very much more on live sound and acoustic instruments, EDM really felt like a splash of cold water, something completely new and different. And for someone who identifies as a musician and was learning to play instruments, I and many people in my situation, in my shoes, felt like EDM represented an attack on all sorts of live played music and what most popular music genres were at that time. So the success of EDM really felt like this wave that threatened to eradicate popular music as we knew it and sort of turn everything digital, so where there would no longer be any live performance, whether vocals or instrumental, at all. Now, I mentioned in the email that from 2023, looking back, that opinion seems a bit passé, but again, that's how it felt at the time. Just like it felt for my colleague in the music department, like the Bee Gees playing over the radio was a big attack on rock music. And so we see these sort of patterns playing out over and over again. And so when EDM, just like disco, first started to bubble up more in the mainstream in the 2000s, there was a lot of people like me who had pushed back against it, maybe who wanted music to sort of stay centered on, you know, the electric guitars and the four-piece band and rock and roll and the like. But now to go to the history here of EDM, as we've noted, it has its roots in the 1970s disco clubs, in Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summers. Then in the 1980s, as disco gets forced back underground, we see some of its artifacts, like the synthesizer and the drum machine, especially the 808 drum machine, live on in pop through Madonna, through Michael Jackson, as well as in early hip-hop that starts to bubble up as well in the late 80s. And in the 1990s, you start to see the flourishing of other electronically influenced genres, things like techno, dub, house, and trance. In other words, the disco music that had been pushed underground started to sort of percolate and reform and evolve into new musical forms that, again, were focused in the clubs and focused on dancing. And then eventually it moved back into the mainstream, especially in Europe, and then came back to the United States as EDM. Now, in 1998, Madonna released an album, Ray of Light, that was really impactful in mainstreaming EDM, as Madonna, who is no stranger into using more of these electronic elements, sort of put forth her first like purely EDM pop album. So that was something that really helped to give it some mainstream attention. Then in the 2000s, DJs like Tiesto, who we'll be looking at, Skrillex, Daft Punk, deadmau5, and more, started achieving these top chart-topping success with various tracks. Now, EDM as a genre is interesting because EDM is basically just an umbrella term. Electronic dance music. What does that describe musically, right? It's just anything that's using electronics and centered around sort of a vibe for dancing. So because of that, the subgenres are really necessary to sort of give it more musical characteristics. But it produces these subgenres incredibly rapidly, sometimes just in the span of a few years. We've already talked about house, techno, trance, there's dubstep, drum and bass, garage, grime, trap, hardstyle, there's acid, moombahton, juke, breakbeat, downtempo, reggaeton, vaporwave, lo-fi these days. And again, I could just go on and on with these various subgenres. There's more subgenres being made even at the present than one can keep up with. So EDM is just sort of this broader umbrella term, the way that popular music or even rock music usually is. Then finally, just some remarks on the music of EDM. So what I found interesting and in a lot of ways threatening back in 2000s me shoes was that musically EDM started to shift a lot of the emphasis on what we valued in popular music. For one thing, it started to shift the emphasis away from purely vocals, which now I find quite interesting, but at the time maybe felt more threatening. EDM songs didn't necessarily always have either prominent vocal tracks, like just a song that follows lyrics, or it used them in interesting ways, sort of like as samples or snippets, almost in an instrumental way, rather than just focusing on the vocal artist. It also featured new experimental forms, and here I do have to mention the dubstep bass. Having, that transition of the dubstep bass drop when the bass drops, that was sort of something new that was being introduced. And, having the form of the song that's like the build up to the bass drop and then what happens after the bass drop, that was a new thing. It wasn't just verse, chorus, bridge, and so on. Those sort of more defined modules. Also, as we've mentioned previously with disco, EDM started to move more towards these long-form tracks, and you'll see this in the Spotify playlist. Instead of just these sort of 3 to 4 minute pop-influenced verse-chorus type of songs, you start to see more experiment with long-form play, things that are 6 minutes and 7 minutes and beyond. And the reason is because the purpose is just to create an appropriate mood or vibe or atmosphere in which to dance. And so if you just do it, with quickly changing modules that follows a trajectory and lands the plane, and it's about 3.5 minutes for radio play, well, that maybe doesn't fit the purpose quite so well, because the purpose is to help people to dance over longer periods of time. And of course, live DJs can spin these tracks out even longer and even longer and even longer. It doesn't have to be just limited to what we listen to on Spotify. Okay, and then finally, for EDM, the prevalence of introducing these synthesized timbres continues to persist today in genres like pop, what we know as electro-pop, or sort of digitally produced pop music, rather than just recording live play in a studio. Rap, of course, the 808 drums machine we've already mentioned, but also the practice of sampling and so many other things that synthesized instruments are used in. And hip-hop more generally. So these are all genres that are very heavily informed by the advancements that were made in EDM. Now let's talk about some early artists, and here I specifically want to highlight two: Yellow Magic Orchestra in Japan and Kraftwerk in Germany. Now I mentioned that disco was pushed underground in the United States mostly because of the backlash against the LGBTQ community. So as a result, the music also was pushed underground and made less visible, especially on the radio. Well, in Europe, that never really was the case, or elsewhere in the world. The sound of disco continued to be very impactful and influential, but there weren't the same social reasons for sort of having a backlash against the music. And so you saw artists like Yellow Magic Orchestra and Kraftwerk just taking the ideas that they heard from early disco and iterating on it. So let's start with the Yellow Magic Orchestra here. The sort of front person and lead composer for Yellow Magic Orchestra is Ryuichi Sakamoto, and he was really on the cutting edge of music technology at the time. First of all, he was an early adopter of the Roland TR-808 rhythm composer or drum machine, which he used in his song A Thousand Knives from 1980. Now, if you are familiar with the history maybe of early hip-hop, this is a very early adoption of the 808. So the sound of Yellow Magic Orchestra and Thousand Knives in particular started to introduce the sounds of 808 beats into the musical stream. It wasn't something that was already going on. It was highly influential, and in fact, this song and other Yellow Magic Orchestra tracks would become frequently sampled by hip-hop and rap artists. Now, in general, the music of Yellow Magic Orchestra explores these themes of humanity and the mechanical becoming one, human and machine. And this was actually thematically played out by Sakamoto in the computer-assisted composition through the Roland MC8 microcomposer sequencer. In other words, you could put a certain grouping of pitches into the sequencer, and the sequencer would arpeggiate it in different ways that was not purely predetermined by the human. The computer had sort of some agency in writing the music. They also were known for incorporating early video game aesthetics, representing a lot of the industry coming out of Japan at the time, such as in their track Computer Game. And next to Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk is another artist that I could just spend, several slides, a whole presentation talking about. But in a quick summary, Kraftwerk also joined into promoting this human-machine thematic imagery, these human-machine metaphor, by having this very uniform look, four people, all with similar haircuts and similar outfits, standing in a row and just hitting samples and triggering certain sounds on their laptops as part of live performance. In other words, the live performance aspect was very stripped back to just sort of present this almost mechanical factory type look. And in general, their form also followed this aesthetic. It was very minimalist with these repeating electronic cells or additive layers that would start to add in one piece and add in another piece until it built on itself. So one example of this is their famous track Autobahn, which is a, again, long-form, 24-minute long track that is meant to capture the mentality of driving on the highway, seeing sort of repetitive elements with new ones introduced, and having music that would have the momentum to propel you driving down the highway, and not necessarily have to change all the time. Now, like Yellow Magic Orchestra, Kraftwerk is extremely influential in the formation of early hip-hop, in being one of the most sampled artists of all time. And because Kraftwerk usually didn't, rarely incorporated vocals, it was very easy for early hip-hop artists to sample and sort of take a beat, take a lick, and incorporate it into their own tracks. So Kraftwerk is very influential to the sound of early hip-hop. Also, they innovated further in how they presented their music live by introducing three-dimensional 3D concerts in the 2010s, which they've continued touring with to this day. But now let's go on to talk about the EDM revival. So Daft Punk as an artist is a duo of Thomas Bangalter and Guy Manuel de Homem Cristo. I am not very good on my French, so I do apologize for that pronunciation. Who were undoubtedly foundational and helped to lay the path for EDM. So Daft Punk kind of is on this early wave that really helped to introduce the sound of EDM back to the world, and especially the United States. Now remember, I mentioned that disco as a genre and a sound had never really been forced back underground in Europe the way they had in the United States. That means people like Daft Punk, who were French, got to really take the sounds and iterate on it and continue developing it and continue to work on it in the discotheques and the clubs, and until it was refined into what could be brought back as EDM. So in 2001, Daft Punk's album Discovery was on the front end of this EDM explosion, and it was an album that combined elements of soft rock, disco, and house in a unique French flavor that was called the French sound or the French touch. By 2006, they also were influential in presenting a live show of their music at Coachella with this lit-up pyramid that became iconic to their image, and that helped basically to usher EDM back into the US mainstream after being underground in clubs for years. And if you know anything about Daft Punk, you also probably know that they have this look of wearing these helmets to obscure their faces in their live performances and events that they DJ. So they were really one of the ones that popularized this faceless robot look that became associated with EDM and with DJs in general. Now, in 2003, anticipating the mainstream acceptance and embrace of Japanese anime here in the West, they produced this collaborative work, Interstellar 5555, that set tracks of their music to a sci-fi film that was inspired by Captain Harlock. And this was a collaboration with the mangaka Leiji Matsumoto, as well as the director Kazuhisa Takenouchi. Daft Punk also created the musical score for the film produced by Disney, Tron Legacy, which is a redo of the original Tron, and they provided it with a pretty much entirely EDM score. I mean, there are some like orchestral and sampled orchestral elements in there, but it's predominantly an EDM aesthetic. So again, going with the theme of the movie, really bringing out mainstream acceptance of the digital, the technological, and the fusion of man and machine. And then in 2013, Daft Punk's album Random Access Memories, which you'll be learning about via the supplemental materials, and specifically the track Get Lucky, featuring Pharrell Williams and Nigel Rodgers, topped the charts. It was extremely successful. And also, like Gloria Gaynor and Donna Summer as well, this proved to be Daft Punk's final complete album. Eventually, the two were still active in producing other projects or collaborating, but the two decided to split and go their separate ways, and mostly continue to just release legacy work ever since. So much like Donna Summer and Gloria Gaynor and disco in general, as we'll see also paralleling what happens with EDM, the career of Daft Punk is one that shines and burns brightly, maybe for about 10, 15 years, and then it burns out. And so what we're left with is sort of the afterglow of their influence in music, even after the artists themselves have retired. And now finally, let's talk about the DJ Tiesto. So born with another name here, I'll try my best to pronounce here, Tige Michel Verwest, that would be from the Netherlands. Tiesto has been hailed as the godfather of EDM. So now, Tiesto originated as a trance artist who had his breakthrough notoriety in 2001 with the album In My Memory. And then from there, he became famous for hosting these Tiesto solo concerts in which he alone as a DJ would DJ about 6+ straight hours of music without any other artists to alternate or to introduce for him. So he would create these long, extensive concerts of his music and remixes of other people's music that could just keep people at festivals and concerts dancing for a long time. So for some other achievements, in 2004, Tiesto played the Athens Olympics opening ceremony, symbolizing another big achievement of mainstream success for EDM. He also set records with 26,000 in attendance at an arena concert in Los Angeles. This record has since been surpassed, but it was very notable at the time. And then continued, even up through the 2010s, jet-setting to DJ shows all over the world. As we'll see, influential DJs like Tiesto were able to play music at festivals or concert shows, taking commissions of $250,000 per show on average. So this became a very lucrative industry for people like Tiesto who would go to DJs these big dance music concerts. In 2017, Tiesto's income was reported to be $39 million that year, which again was probably his peak, but is quite notable for that amount. And Tiesto's success, both financially and artistically, paved the way for other DJs like Avicii, Martin Garrix, Deadmau5, and many, many others to rise to mainstream acceptance in the EDM world. Now, this mainstream success of EDM as a genre has led to some lasting influence that we feel in our music even to this day. So while the fears that I and others had back in the 2000s about EDM taking over popular music and completely displacing live performance or live vocals never materialized, the influence and the lasting impact of EDM, even though as a genre it's sort of maybe faded or settled back into sort of a manageable niche, the influence of EDM continues to this day. Particularly the musical elements of EDM have been integrated with pop music into a genre that we can know today as electropop. However, we don't really go around calling things electropop. It sort of just is the new paradigm, the new state of pop music today. So it's not so much that we look at the music being made now and say, oh, we're now listening to electropop. It's more like the impact of EDM has become so pervasive in today's music that we don't even question it. And so we can certainly call it the name of electropop. I think most of the time we don't even really think about the way that EDM has influenced the music we continue to hear. And of course, a big part of that same dialogue goes to the influence of hip-hop and of rap and R&B, but as we mentioned with Kraftwerk and Yellow Magic Orchestra, those two have been influenced by early EDM. So you see the influence of EDM is just woven through pretty much everything at this point. Now as for Tiesto, even though Tiesto's heyday may have been just like the genre of EDM earlier in the early 2010s, Tiesto remains active as a mentor for other DJs and producers, as a producer of tracks of his own and for others, and a collaborator with other artists on their tracks. And so even though probably at a point DJ Tiesto is at a point of not needing to work in order to live and to survive, he continues to sort of be a presence in the field and in the industry, helping others in their music, much like Daft Punk did before. And that's going to do it for this week's Soundbites video, just a quick introduction to the through line of disco to house and techno and leading to EDM, as well as some of the major artists that you'll want to know from these genres. Again, could have picked dozens of possible case studies, but these are the ones I chose to focus on to really give you a sense of the landscape. As for this week's supplemental materials, definitely be sure to pay attention to the elements about the backlash against disco, which will be one of the subjects for our flip video discussion. There's a long article about that, as well as the documentary on Disco Demolition Night. As well as another one that I just particularly enjoy is the Soundfield video that talks about whatever happened to dubstep. So this genre, again, that from my perspective seemed like it was going to take over all of music at one point, seems to sort of have just materialized and dissolved into the ether like cotton candy. And again, I think they also do a good job of talking about what I've mentioned, which is the continuing influences of that genre and EDM in general in all sorts of existing extant genres that we listen to today. Alright, and with that, I'll go ahead and say bye-bye for now.